Alright, well, I've opened up my Xbox completely, and this is the Xbox motherboard. Some things you might recognize here. This is the back of it, where the Ethernet and the USB audio video cable, and this monstrous power source. So I've just taken out the CPU heatsink and a GPU heatsink. And this right here is the GPU, and this right here is the CPU. Um, excuse me, there's some dust flying around. This thing hasn't been opened before. So what happened is that I removed this the CPU heatsink first, and it looked like everything was pretty much normal. Try to focus in on there. It's kind of difficult. Not so much problems with the CPU. I see it. It looks like just any other, to be honest. They put the thermal grease on there. That gooey stuff, by the way, is thermal grease. I call it thermal grease. Some people call it thermal paste. Some people call it heat sink compound. It has many different names. The point is to transfer heat from something to a heat sink or some other method of dissipating. It doesn't necessarily have to be heat sink. But the CPU one looks fine to me. I've seen this kind before. Not any problems at all. Now, when we move to the GPU, that right there is the GPU, and looks like some kind of coprocessor there. Perhaps has to do with maybe the memory bus or something. Because the memory is, I believe, that it's right next to the GPU. It's not on the GPU, maybe not. Actually, I have no idea. Don't quote me on that. I have no idea where the RAM is. I've never looked at it, but I do know that the bus speed between the RAM and the GPU is incredibly fast on the Xbox. One thing I noticed here, though, if you take a quick look at it, that kind of looks bad. You'll be able to see it in my still pictures, and I'm also recording it from the phone. If I bring it into some good, decent light, right there, looks like that glob, they just spit it on there, and they just put the heatsink on top. Yeah, this problem right here, that's that's thermal compound burning. It's because it was applied uneven. And so, because it was uneven, there were some air pockets in there, and air pockets will cause the thermal grease to burn. And it also wasn't as thick as I think it should have been. In regard to it's not very evenly applied, and it needs to be even, and it needs to be very thin, and there shouldn't be one part of it thinner than the other section as well. With these, God, I forgot what they call them, the X something. But they, let's see, the X clamps is what they call them, and they basically, if you've ever put a heatsink on top of a CPU on a computer motherboard, you are attaching the heatsink directly onto the motherboard. So if heat is really, really intense and the motherboard does warp, the heatsink does warp with it. It does bend with the motherboard. It is firmly placed with the motherboard, and that's how it's always been. That's how it's been for the last 40 years in computing. Microsoft decided to have the heatsink be given a little bit of wiggle room. So from the heatsink, it's not attached to the motherboard. It's attached to these X clamps that are only touching the motherboard in a center position, not on all fours. All these 4 points right here, they go right on top of the motherboard, the heatsink, and it's held in place. The motherboard goes in there in that thinner area. But the point is that the heatsink is not attached to the motherboard. It's attached basically mostly to itself, and only one part of it is really touching the motherboard, or pressed against the motherboard, if you will. That's about it. And also, these things, they're very bendable. Again, they were given so that the heat sinks can move, given some wiggle room. It was a nice idea maybe for 1970 when they were doing all these different things for computers, but obviously the computer industry has not moved to anything near this type of attachment. And I would guess because maybe somebody did it and maybe they thought it was a bad idea. That right there, the X clamp, and the fact that this heatsink, your GPU heatsink, is thinner than this. Now, it is given a lot more surface area, and if it wasn't for that extra surface area, it would have been pretty disastrous. Much more red rings. The problem was they had to make it wider, okay, but it used to be longer to dissipate more heat, and this thing is entirely aluminum. Aluminum isn't bad, but you need some copper on there. That right there is what I'm talking about. This is a real heatsink. This right there, the bronze-looking metal is copper. The silver is aluminum. And you see the CPU attaches to the copper, and the copper is attached to the aluminum. And then the aluminum dissipates the heat much quicker. But as well, there's this extra little copper tube you see going from the main copper heatsink, part of the heatsink, down the top part of the heatsink to dissipate heat much better. As you see it, you can kind of see right through. This is a well-designed heatsink. This is a heatsink that the Xbox GPU probably had to begin with, something very similar, if not, part copper, because maybe it was all aluminum, but it was much bigger. And the reason for that is when you put this thing right on top, this is what you get. It's right there. Guess what goes right on top? It's from, this is the front. This is the right side of the Xbox if you're looking at it. It's the left side of the Xbox if you're looking at it. What goes right there is the DVD drive. Last minute thing, they designed this entire system that looks like it without the optical drive, any idea of it. The optical drive is fairly big. You wonder, even at the time of the Xbox, there were much thinner optical drives that would have given a chance for, the designers. They needed to save money. I understand that. So they opt in with different vendors, and these vendors, that's all they got. So whatever, they shrunk the heatsink, and the heatsink is total crap. But you work with what you can get. And for all intents and purposes, it does work. The problem is that it moves. It moves when it's connected because the heat of the GPU warps the motherboard and the soldering of it. What you need to do is prevent the heatsink from moving at all, firmly place it against the GPU. The GPU processor itself cannot be allowed to move against its soldering. It has to stay firmly in place. It has to be pressured, basically. It's exactly what it is. You need to push right on top of it. This thing needs to be right on top of it and, basically push down. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to use these. I'm going to take these off, and I'm going to connect a machine screw to it. It's one of the guides that's online for a lot of people fixing the red ring problem. And then we'll see how it goes. So if you've been wondering why your Xbox had red ring, well, this is the main reason. This GPU and its coprocessor. It looks like a combination of thermal paste burn, which increases the heat. The heat warps the motherboard. The motherboard moves against the heatsink, so the heatsink moves in a completely different manner than the motherboard does, because it's not firmly attached to the motherboard. It's not really attached to it at all. And heat increases, and what's left is well, the soldering starts breaking off on the GPU, and connections get missed here and there, errors in the very beginning of starting up a system are going to pile up very, very quickly. You got your quote unquote red ring of death, and that's the nutshell.